The first thing Wyatt Harlan thought when the warship blocked out the evening sun was that somebody had finally come to take the girls back. The shadow rolled over the wheat field slow and heavy, turning 30 acres of gold into bruised gray in less than 10 seconds. Wyatt stood beside the western fence line with a spool of rusted wire hanging from one hand and stared upward without blinking. The ship was enormous, bigger than the old mining rigs that sometimes crossed the upper atmosphere on freight routes, bigger than the grain silos down in Mercer Township, bigger than anything that had business hovering above a lonely farm 300 miles from the nearest city. The low hum of its engines vibrated through the dirt beneath his boots. Cricket, his old brown mutt, pressed tight against his leg and let out a nervous whine deep in her throat. Wyatt did not move. At 34, he had learned there were moments in life where moving too quickly only made a bad thing arrive faster. The warship hung above the property like judgment itself, matte black against the bruised orange sky of Tambark Reach. Wind rolled outward beneath it in slow circles, flattening the wheat and rattling the tin roof of the barn hard enough to make the hinges squeal. Somewhere behind the house, one of the goats cried out in panic. Wyatt tightened his grip on the wire spool until the metal bit into his palm. 6 months ago, this farm had been silent. 6 months ago, the only living thing waiting for him at sunset had been a tired dog and the ache in his shoulder that never quite left after the border corps. Then a barefoot alien woman had walked out of the trees with 3 little girls and changed the sound of the whole house. Another pulse of engine vibration rolled across the fields. Dust drifted from the porch roof. The front screen door creaked open behind him. Wyatt heard the small footsteps first, then Emma's sleepy voice. "Mr. Wyatt?" He closed his eyes for one brief second before turning around. Emma stood barefoot in the doorway, clutching the faded blue blanket he had found for her at a church market 2 towns over. Her silver-white hair was tangled from sleep and one side of. Her small lavender face still carried the crease from a pillow. Behind her stood Irie, half hidden the way she always was when frightened, one hand gripping the doorframe so tightly her knuckles had gone pale violet. Naya stood in front of both sisters automatically, protective even now, dark eyes fixed on the warship above the fields with the stillness of somebody too young to carry that much fear. And behind the girls stood Sayila. She looked thinner in the porch light than she had that first night at the fence line, but healthier too somehow, like safety itself had slowly put flesh back onto her bones. Her silver hair moved softly in the wind coming off the fields. Her eyes found Wyatt's face immediately. Not the ship. Him. That was the part that made his chest tighten, because she already knew what he was thinking. Somebody found us. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The warship continued hovering overhead with terrible patience. Wyatt looked from the frightened little girls to the woman standing behind them in silence. And for the first time since they arrived on his farm, he realized he would rather lose the house, the land, and every dollar he had left than watch those children become afraid again. Then a line of white lights ignited beneath the ship, and something started descending toward the farm. The thing descending from the warship was not a shuttle. Wyatt knew that immediately. He had seen military shuttles before during his years in the Border Corps, ugly square machines built to move equipment and frighten soldiers from one bad place to another. This craft looked different. Sleek, silver-black, quiet in a way that made the back of his neck tighten. It lowered slowly toward the north pasture with the kind of controlled precision that only expensive machines had. Wheat bent flat beneath the pressure waves from its engines. Emma made a frightened sound and buried her face against Saila's side. Wyatt stepped forward without thinking, putting himself between the porch and the descending craft. The movement was automatic now. Protective in the same unconscious way breathing was automatic. Beside him, Cricket barked once and then stopped, uncertain. Whether this was danger or something worse than danger. Saila watched him for a moment with an expression so tired it barely looked human anymore. Then she spoke quietly. "You should let us go before they land." Wyatt kept his eyes on the craft. "No, Wyatt. No." The silver lights beneath the ship dimmed as it settled 20 yards beyond the fence line. Dust rolled outward across the field in soft brown waves. The porch light flickered once. Somewhere inside the house, one of the kitchen pans rattled against the stove from the vibration. Wyatt heard Irie start crying softly behind him, trying hard not to let anyone hear it. Naya immediately wrapped both arms around her little sister without taking her eyes off the ship. That child was always watching for danger first, always calculating exits. Wyatt hated that about the world more than he could explain. The engines finally went silent. Real silence followed. Heavy silence. The kind that made every tiny sound feel important. Whined through dry wheat. The creak of porch wood. Emma sniffling into Saila's tunic. Then the side hatch of the craft unfolded downward in one smooth motion. Warm white light spilled across the pasture. A figure appeared at the top of the ramp. Tall. Thin. Wrapped in dark formal clothing that moved gently in the wind. Not armor. Not military. Wyatt noticed that immediately, too. The woman standing there had silver white hair gathered behind her shoulders and skin the same deep violet shade as Saila and the girls. Older, though. Much older. Not elderly exactly, but carrying the kind of stillness that came from a lifetime of people moving aside when you entered a room. Two more figures stepped out behind her in gray uniforms, their posture alert but not aggressive. Guards, Wyatt guessed. The older woman looked toward the porch. Her eyes landed first on Saila. For one terrible second, Wyatt thought Saila might collapse. The alien woman beside him drew in a shaky breath that sounded dangerously close to breaking apart. Emma looked upward in confusion. Mama. Saila dropped to one knee so fast it startled all three girls. Her hands trembled as she held Emma close. Wyatt stared at her. In 6 months he had never once seen Saila kneel for anyone. Not even when she arrived exhausted and starving at his property. The older woman descended the ramp slowly. She crossed the field without hurry, her dark clothing brushing through flattened wheat. The two guards remained behind her at a respectful distance. Wyatt noticed that too. Respectful distance from her. Not protection. Deference. Beside him, Nea whispered something in her own language under her breath. Fear and recognition mixed together. The older woman stopped a few feet from the porch steps. Her eyes moved over the girls first. Lingering. Counting. Making certain they were real. Then her gaze shifted toward Wyatt. He felt strangely underdressed standing there in old work boots and a faded flannel shirt with dirt still on his sleeves from fixing fence posts. The woman studied him for several long seconds before finally speaking in careful trade standard. You are Wyatt Harlan. It was not a question. Wyatt nodded once. The woman looked past him toward the warm yellow light spilling from the farmhouse windows, toward the sound of a kettle still quietly rattling on the stove inside, toward the home that had held her family together when apparently nobody else had. When she spoke again, her voice softened by the smallest amount. My daughter told me there was still one decent man left on this planet. Wyatt did not know what to do with the kind of silence that followed words like that. The wind moved softly through the wheat around the farmhouse while the enormous warship hovered above the property like a second night sky, but nobody on the porch spoke for several seconds. The older woman kept her eyes on him calmly, studying him with the same careful attention Nea sometimes used when deciding whether a strange noise outside was dangerous. Up close, Wyatt could see faint silver markings along the woman's temples and throat, delicate lines that caught the porch light whenever she turned her head. Expensive clothing, expensive ship, expensive silence. Everything about her carried the weight of authority without needing to announce it. Wyatt shifted his stance slightly and glanced toward Saila. She was still kneeling beside Emma, one arm wrapped protectively around the little girl while Irie clung quietly to her shoulder. Nea remained standing in front of them all, always first between danger and her sisters. The child looked exhausted even now. You should all come inside, Wyatt said finally. His voice sounded rough from disuse. Kids should not be standing in cold wind this late. The older woman blinked once, surprised by the invitation more than the words themselves. Then her gaze drifted toward the farmhouse windows again, where warm yellow light spilled out into the dark yard. Something softened in her expression so quickly Wyatt almost missed it. Thank you, she said quietly. The two guards exchanged a brief glance behind her, but said nothing. Wyatt opened the screen door and stepped aside automatically so the girls could enter first. Emma shuffled inside wrapped in her blanket, still rubbing sleep from her eyes. Irie hurried after her without lifting her gaze from the floorboards. Nea paused near Wyatt for half a second before walking in. She hesitated just long enough for him to notice she trusted standing near him now. That small realization hit harder than he expected. Saila rose slowly from the porch and brushed dirt from her worn tunic with embarrassed movements that reminded Wyatt painfully of the first week she arrived, when she apologized every time she took up space in the house. The older woman entered last. She stopped just inside the doorway and looked around the farmhouse kitchen in silence. The place was small. Old pine cabinets, scuffed wooden floors, a cast iron stove that clicked softly with heat. Wyatt's late wife had painted the walls pale cream years ago because she said dark winters felt shorter in brighter rooms. Nothing about the house looked important, but the older woman stared at the kitchen table like it mattered. Emma climbed immediately into her usual chair beside the stove, the one Wyatt had reinforced with scrap lumber because it rocked unevenly. Irie sat close beside her. Naya remained standing until Saila touched her shoulder gently. Only then did the girl sit down too. Wyatt moved automatically toward the kettle still warming on the stove. "Coffee," he said toward the older woman. "Or tea. I think Saila left tea leaves in the cabinet somewhere." The woman watched him quietly for a second before answering. "Tea would be welcome." Wyatt nodded once and reached for the cabinet without another word. His hands moved through familiar routines while tension still sat heavy in the room. Cups. Water. The small tin of imported leaves Saila rationed carefully because she said the smell reminded her of home before everything went bad. He noticed the older woman watching those details too. The ordinary parts. The practice parts. The parts that said these people belonged here more than guests did. Emma yawned loudly from the table and leaned sideways against Irie until both girls nearly tipped together. The older woman's face changed instantly at the sight of them. Not powerful now. Not royal. Just relieved. Deeply relieved in a way that made her suddenly look much older. She swallowed once before speaking softly toward Saila in their own language. Saila answered quietly without looking up. Wyatt did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. Family. Worry. Gratitude. Then the older woman turned back toward him while he poured steaming water into worn ceramic cups. "My name," she said carefully, "is Elora Vermeyer." She paused for one brief second. "And I believe you saved my daughter's life." Wyatt stared at the steam curling upward from the teacups because it felt easier than looking directly at Elora Vermeyer after a sentence like that. Outside, the distant hum of the warship still rolled softly across the fields, but inside the farmhouse kitchen everything had narrowed down to small, ordinary sounds. The tick of the stove cooling. Emma's quiet breathing from the table. Irie rubbing tired eyes with both fists. Cricket settling heavily onto the floorboards beside the back door with a long sigh. Wyatt handed Elora a cup carefully, aware all at once of the grease stains still on his sleeve from repairing tractor parts earlier that afternoon. Elora accepted the tea with both hands. "Thank you," she said again, softer this time. She looked around the kitchen once. More, slower now, taking in details the way people do when they are trying to understand how someone survived loneliness for too long. The old calendar beside the fridge still turned to April even though it was October. A faded jacket hanging near the door. The extra set of tiny boots Wyatt had lined up beside the heater vent so the girls would have warm shoes in the morning. None of it looked important to him anymore because he had gotten used to it. But Elora noticed all of it. Saila finally sat down at the table beside her daughters, though her posture remained tense enough that Wyatt doubted she had relaxed fully even once in the past 6 months. Emma leaned sideways until her head rested against Saila's arm. Naya stayed alert despite obvious exhaustion, dark eyes moving constantly between the windows and the strangers outside near the ship. Wyatt crossed quietly to the stove and opened the small oven beneath it. The leftover cornbread from supper still sat wrapped in cloth beside a pan of beans and smoked turkey. He hesitated only a second before pulling everything out. "The girls should eat before bed," he muttered. Saila looked up immediately. "Wyatt, you do not need to. Kids are hungry every 2 hours at that age," he said simply. "I learned that fast around here." The smallest smile touched Emma's sleepy face at the word hungry. It vanished almost immediately, but Wyatt saw it. Elora saw it too. Something inside the older woman seemed to break apart quietly at the sight of that tiny expression. Wyatt moved around the kitchen gathering bowls while the room settled into a strange, uneasy calm. Then Elora spoke again. "Saila's transmission reached us only 12 days ago." Wyatt paused. "Transmission?" Saila lowered her eyes toward the table. I did not tell you, she said softly. I was afraid if they found me before I understood their intentions. She stopped there. Wyatt nodded once. He understood enough. Fear changed people. 6 months ago, Saila had arrived at his fence line barefoot, carrying one sleeping child while the other two could barely stand from hunger. She had flinched whenever he reached too quickly for anything. The first week, she slept sitting upright beside the girls because she thought someone might come take them during the night. Wyatt remembered pretending not to notice when she quietly checked the locks 3 times before bed. Elora wrapped both hands around the teacup and looked toward her daughter with unmistakable regret. We searched for you for almost 2 years, she said quietly. After Darian died, the council told me you had left willingly. Saila let out one short bitter laugh that did not sound amused at all. Nea looked downward immediately, like even hearing those memories hurt. Irie stopped eating entirely. Wyatt felt tension slide back into the room like cold air under a door. He set fresh cornbread carefully onto the table beside Emma instead. The little girl blinked at it with sleepy surprise. Then, almost automatically, she broke the piece exactly in half and handed part of it to Irie before taking a bite herself. Wyatt looked away quickly after that, because something about small children sharing food like it might disappear tomorrow always hit him harder than it should. Elora noticed his expression. You care for them deeply, she said quietly. Wyatt rubbed a tired hand across the back of his neck. They are kids, he answered after a moment. That should be enough reason for anybody. The room fell silent again. Then, very softly from the far side of the table, Nea finally spoke directly to him. Most people did not think so. Nea's words settled over the kitchen heavier than the sound of the warship outside. Wyatt stood still beside the stove with one hand resting on the counter, suddenly unsure where to look. The oldest girl kept her eyes lowered after speaking, as if she regretted saying anything at all. Irie quietly tore pieces from her cornbread without eating them, arranging crumbs into tiny nervous piles beside her bowl. Emma had already fallen halfway asleep against Saila's side, with one small hand still clutching the edge of her blanket. The ordinary warmth of the kitchen pressed softly against the windows while cold nights stretched across the fields outside. Wyatt finally pulled out a chair across from the girls and sat down slowly. The old wood creaked beneath his weight. Well, he said after a long moment, most people are wrong about plenty of things. Nea looked up at him carefully then, like she was trying to decide whether humor was allowed in this house. It was the closest thing to a joke Wyatt had made in months. Elora noticed it too. A faint sadness touched her face as she wrapped both hands around the warm teacup. You sound like my husband, she said quietly. Saila lowered her eyes again at the mention of him. Wyatt noticed the shift immediately. There were certain griefs in the world that changed the temperature of a room the second they appeared. He knew that feeling too well. He leaned back slightly in the chair and rubbed at the ache in his shoulder while the girls continued eating. What happened to him? He asked gently. Saila was silent for several seconds. Outside, wind moved across the wheat in long whispering waves. Finally she answered. Darian believed the council would protect us after he died. Her voice stayed calm, but Wyatt noticed how tightly she held Emma against her side while she spoke. He was wrong. Elora closed her eyes briefly. There were factions within the houses who believed Saila and the girls' weakened inheritance claims. Wyatt frowned slightly. They are children. Elora gave him a tired look full of old disappointment. Politics has never cared very much about children. Silence followed that. Wyatt hated how true it sounded. Cricket lifted her head from the floor beside the back door and wandered toward the table, nails clicking softly against the wood. Emma stirred immediately in her sleep and reached downward automatically. The old dog rested her gray muzzle against the little girl's lap without hesitation. Wyatt watched Emma smile in her sleep at the contact. Small things like that still surprised him sometimes. 6 months ago, the girls had jumped at sudden movements and ate like frightened animals, expecting food to vanish. Now Emma fell asleep at kitchen tables beside warm dogs and half-finished bread. Healing happened quietly. So quietly most people missed it while it was happening. Elora watched the sleeping child too. When Saila was young, she said softly, she used to bring injured birds into the palace gardens and hide them beneath her bed until they healed. Saila gave her mother an embarrassed look. Mama. But Elora only smiled faintly into her tea. You cried for 2 days when one of them flew away. Wyatt glanced toward Saila with genuine surprise. The alien woman sitting across from him looked so constantly exhausted and guarded that imagining her as a sheltered young girl felt strange somehow. Sayila noticed the look and shook her head softly. That was before reality found me. Wyatt understood that sentence more than he wanted to admit. The kitchen grew quieter after that. Irie finally finished eating and curled sideways against Nea's shoulder. Emma was fully asleep now, cheek pressed against Sayila's arm, while Cricket kept watch beside her chair like an old guardian. Elora looked at the girls for a long time before speaking again. They are safer with you than they ever were under our protection. Wyatt blinked once at that. I do not know about that. I do. Elora answered immediately. Her voice carried absolute certainty now. Because when frightened children begin to sleep deeply again, it means someone has convinced their nervous system the danger is finally over. Wyatt looked instinctively toward the girls at the table. The little house felt impossibly full compared to the silence it used to hold. Then Elora quietly added, "The problem is that other people are beginning to realize where my daughter disappeared to." The words settled heavily over the kitchen table, while the little farmhouse seemed to shrink around them. Wyatt looked toward the dark window above the sink where the reflection of the room shimmered faintly against the glass. Warm light. Sleeping children. Steam rising from half-finished tea. It looked peaceful enough to fool somebody passing by on the road into thinking nothing bad had ever touched this place. But Wyatt had spent too many years learning how quickly peace could disappear once the wrong people noticed it existed. He leaned back slowly in his chair and folded his arms. "What kind of people?" he asked. Elora answered carefully. "The kind who believe vulnerable families are easier to control than united ones." Wyatt's jaw tightened slightly. That sounded like politics to him. The ugly kind. The kind that smiled while taking things away. Across the table, Sayila finally lifted her eyes toward her mother. "You said the council agreed to stop pursuing us." Elora gave a tired nod. "Officially, yes." The word officially carried enough bitterness behind it to explain everything. Nea listened quietly from her chair, far too attentive for a child her age. Wyatt noticed how the girl's body stiffened every time adults talked about councils, or officials, or claims. Like those words had become warnings instead of language. Emma stirred again in her sleep beside Sayila, mumbling softly before settling deeper against her side. Irie looked exhausted enough to fall asleep upright. Wyatt rubbed a hand over his face slowly. "Well," he muttered, "nobody is dragging tired kids out of this house tonight." Sayila looked at him immediately. The expression on her face hit him harder than he expected. Not surprise exactly. Relief. The kind that hurts because somebody has been carrying fear too long. Elora studied him silently for several seconds. "You understand they may eventually come with authority recognized beyond your world," she said gently. "People like that usually do," Wyatt answered. He stood from the table with a low groan from his shoulder and crossed toward the kitchen cabinet beside the refrigerator. The old hinges squeaked when he opened it. Inside sat a small row of mismatched mugs, canned vegetables, coffee tins, and the worn metal box where he kept extra ammunition from another life he barely liked remembering anymore. He moved the box farther behind the coffee without thinking, shielding it from the girl's view out of old instinct. Then he grabbed blankets from the upper shelf instead. Elora noticed that too. Wyatt handed the blankets toward Sayila first. "Put the little ones to bed before they fall asleep in chairs." Emma barely woke when Sayila lifted her carefully into her arms. The child simply curled closer against her mother's shoulder with complete trust. Wyatt watched that tiny unconscious movement quietly. 6 months ago, Emma used to wake crying from nightmares almost every night. Sometimes she still did during thunderstorms. But now she reached for comfort automatically instead of fear. That mattered more to Wyatt than any warship sitting outside his fields. Irie slid from her chair sleepily while Nea helped straighten the blanket around her shoulders without being asked. The oldest girl moved through the kitchen with the habit of somebody used to taking care of others before herself. Wyatt hated that too. Kids should have been worried about school lunches and muddy shoes, and whether winter snow days would close classrooms. Not survival. Sayila paused near the hallway leading toward the bedrooms. "Wyatt," she said softly. He looked up from the table. She hesitated for a second before speaking again. "If this becomes dangerous for you." "It already became dangerous the second Cricket let 4 strangers walk onto my property 6 months ago," he said. "Too late now." To his surprise, a quiet laugh escaped Nea at that. Tiny, brief, but real. The sound startled everyone at the table, including Naya herself. Wyatt looked over and saw the girl immediately trying to hide the smile afterward like she had done something wrong. Elora watched the moment carefully. Her eyes softened in a way that suddenly made her look less like royalty and more like somebody's tired mother. Saila disappeared down the hallway carrying Emma, while Irie followed close behind wrapped in blankets. Naya lingered at the kitchen doorway 1 second longer than her sisters. Then she looked back toward Wyatt and spoke so quietly he almost missed it. I think this is the first place Emma stopped being afraid to sleep. Wyatt felt something twist painfully in his chest at those words. Then, outside beyond the dark windows, another engine sound echoed across the wheat fields. And this time, it was not coming from Elora's ship. The second engine sound was smaller than the warship overhead, but somehow more dangerous because it came low and fast across the fields. Wyatt crossed the kitchen in 3 long steps and looked through the dark window above the sink. Twin white headlights bounced along the dirt road leading toward the farmhouse, cutting through the wheat like knives through water. Not local traffic. Nobody drove out this far after dark unless they already knew where they were going. Behind him, Elora stood slowly from the table. Her expression changed instantly. Calm disappeared. In its place came something colder and far more experienced. How many roads lead to your property? She asked quietly. 1, Wyatt answered. That one. He was already moving toward the mudroom before she finished speaking. The old rifle still leaned against the wall beside the coats where he had left it earlier. He picked it up automatically, checking the chamber out of long habit more than intent. Elora noticed the movement, but said nothing. Cricket rose from the floor immediately, ears lifted, body tense. The farmhouse suddenly felt very small. Wyatt glanced toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms where Saila had taken the girls. He could already hear soft movement back there. Floorboards creaking. Whispered voices. Fear traveled fast through children. The headlights grew brighter outside, finally slowing near the front gate instead of the porch. Wyatt exhaled once through his nose. Better than them driving straight up to the house. Elora stepped closer beside him near the window. Those are not my people, she said. Wyatt believed her instantly. Something about the way she spoke carried genuine concern now instead of diplomacy. The vehicle stopped near the fence line with its engines still running. Dust drifted slowly through the headlights. 3 figures stepped out. Long coats. Dark silhouettes. One remained near the vehicle while the other 2 started walking toward the farmhouse through the wheat. Calm. Purposeful. Wyatt felt the familiar tightness settle into his shoulders that always came before trouble. Stay inside, he said quietly. Elora looked almost offended by the suggestion. Mr. Harlan, I did not cross 3 systems to hide behind your kitchen walls. Wyatt gave her a tired glance. Lady, if somebody starts arguing on my property at midnight, the least useful thing I can have is more people standing in doorways. For the first time since arriving, Elora looked genuinely surprised into silence. Then, unexpectedly, a tiny smile touched the corner of her mouth. Behind them, Naya appeared silently at the hallway entrance. The child had wrapped a blanket around Irie's shoulders and stood half in front of her sister protectively even now. Wyatt lowered the rifle slightly the moment he saw them. Back to bed, he said gently. Naya did not move. Are they taking us again? She whispered. The question hit the room harder than shouting would have. Wyatt stared at her for 1 painful second before answering. No, he said it simply, like fact instead of comfort. Naya searched his face carefully, deciding whether to believe him. Then she nodded once and guided Irie farther back down the hallway without another word. Wyatt waited until they disappeared before stepping onto the porch. Cold wind rolled across the fields immediately. The warship still hovered above the property in complete silence now, massive enough to darken half the stars overhead. The 2 approaching figures stopped about 20 feet from the porch steps. One was human, tall, gray-haired, expensive coat too clean for farm roads. The other carried himself with the stiff posture of private security. Wyatt had met enough men like that during freight runs and border contracts to recognize the type instantly. The older human looked toward the warship above them first, then toward Wyatt holding the rifle across one shoulder. Mr. Harlan, he called calmly. My name is Victor Soren. I represent the Vermeer Inheritance Council. Wyatt did not answer immediately. Victor continued anyway. We are here regarding the unlawful concealment of Saila Vermeyer and her daughters. Behind Wyatt, the farmhouse screen door creaked softly open. Saila stepped onto the porch barefoot, one hand gripping the doorframe hard enough for her knuckles to pale. Wyatt heard the fear in her breathing before she spoke. Do not let them take the girls. Something in Wyatt hardened permanently at the sound of that sentence. He rested one hand against the porch railing and looked back toward the men standing beyond his fields. Funny thing, he said quietly. You all keep talking like children are property. For a moment, nobody in the field moved. Wind rolled slowly through the wheat beneath the black shadow of the warship overhead, while Victor Soren stood with both hands visible at his sides, wearing the calm expression of a man used to winning arguments simply because he represented larger people. Wyatt had met men like that before too. Men who smiled politely while deciding what parts of your life belonged to somebody richer. Saila remained frozen in the doorway behind him. Wyatt could feel her fear without even turning around. It sat in the cold night air like another living thing. Victor glanced briefly toward the massive ship hovering above the farm and adjusted his tone carefully. Mr. Harlan, nobody here wishes to cause distress. Wyatt almost laughed at that. Almost. Funny way of showing it, he muttered. The security man beside Victor shifted slightly in the wheat, one hand near his coat. Wyatt noticed immediately. Old instincts never fully died. Elora stepped onto the porch then, elegant even beneath farm porch lighting and drifting dust. The second Victor saw her, the color drained slightly from his face. Not fear exactly. Calculation. Wyatt recognized that too. Elora descended the porch steps slowly until she stood beside Wyatt in the cold wind. You came without council authorization, she said calmly. Victor straightened. Lady Vermeyer, we came to secure the heirs before further complications developed. Complications, Elora repeated softly. Is that what starving children are called now? Victor's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Behind Wyatt, the screen door creaked open another few inches. Naya stood there silently holding Irie's hand while Emma peeked sleepily around Saila's leg wrapped in blankets. Wyatt noticed Victor looking toward the children immediately. Not warmly. Not cruelly either. Just clinically. Like assets finally located after going missing too long. Something deep in Wyatt's chest turned cold at that look. He stepped sideways without thinking, blocking the children from clearer view. Victor looked back toward him. Mr. Harlan, you have shown generosity beyond expectation, he said. Carefully. But these matters extend beyond your understanding. Wyatt stared at him for several seconds. Then he rested the rifle against the porch rail and crossed his arms instead. I understand hungry kids, he answered quietly. I understand people showing up frightened enough to sleep with shoes on for weeks. I understand a woman apologizing every time she takes food from the fridge because she thinks safety always expires eventually. The night fell silent again except for distant engines overhead. Wyatt kept going before anybody interrupted him. And I understand that the first time Emma laughed in this house, her sisters both looked scared because they forgot children were allowed to sound happy. Saila lowered her head sharply at those words. Naya gripped the blanket tighter around Irie's shoulders. Even Elora looked shaken now. Victor remained still, though something uncertain flickered briefly across his expression for the first time. Wyatt rubbed a tired hand over his jaw before speaking again. So maybe I do understand this situation more than you think. The security man beside Victor shifted again. Sir, he began carefully. The girls belong to the Vermeyer line. Their futures affect intersystem agreements far larger than this farm. Wyatt nodded once. That may be true. He looked back toward the porch where the girls stood huddled together beneath warm kitchen light. Emma's eyes were barely staying open. Irie leaned against Naya sleepily. Saila stood behind all three of them like somebody prepared to break apart before letting the world touch her children again. Wyatt looked back toward Victor slowly. But tonight they are just tired little girls. The words landed harder than shouting would have. Nobody answered immediately. The warship above the property hummed softly against the clouds. Then, unexpectedly, Elora stepped forward until she stood directly between Victor and the farmhouse porch. The children remain here tonight, she said. Calm. Absolute. That is not a request. Victor hesitated for the first time since arriving. Wyatt watched him calculate possibilities behind his eyes. Political consequences. Royal authority. The giant. Warship hovering overhead. Finally, Victor lowered his gaze slightly. Of course, Lady Vermeer. Elora did not move. And tomorrow, she continued quietly, the council will hear exactly how my grandchildren were treated while respectable men debated inheritance structures. Victor's face lost another shade of color. Wyatt glanced sideways toward Elora then, realizing suddenly that the most dangerous person on the property might not be the man holding the rifle after all. Then Emma's tiny, sleepy voice drifted softly from the porch behind them. Mr. Wyatt? Wyatt turned immediately. Emma lifted both arms toward him without hesitation, blanket sliding halfway to the floor. Can you carry me? And without thinking even once about warships or councils or politics, Wyatt walked back toward the house. Emma weighed almost nothing when Wyatt lifted her into his arms. That bothered him every single time. Children should have weight to them. Warm, healthy weight from full dinners and safe sleep and ordinary lives. But Emma still felt too light beneath the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, though healthier now than the tiny, frightened child who had stumbled onto his property 6 months earlier. She rested her sleepy head against his chest immediately, trusting him with the easy certainty children only gave to people who had proven themselves over and over again. Wyatt carried her inside while cold wind and politics stayed outside on the porch where they belonged. Behind him, Irie followed quietly holding Nea's hand. Saila lingered at the doorway for one long moment, eyes fixed on Wyatt carrying her youngest daughter through the kitchen like it was the most impossible thing she had ever seen. Then she lowered her head slightly and followed them inside too. Elora entered last. The screen door shut behind her with a soft click that somehow sounded final. Outside, Victor Soren and his security escort remained near the fence line beneath the shadow of the warship, but none of them approached the house again. The kitchen felt warmer now, safer. Wyatt carried Emma down the narrow hallway toward the small bedroom beside the laundry room. The little girl stirred once against his shoulder. Did the scary people leave? She mumbled sleepily. Wyatt adjusted the blanket around her carefully before answering. For tonight, yeah. Emma nodded against his chest like that answer was enough to solve the entire universe. Maybe for children it was. Wyatt pushed open the bedroom door with his shoulder. The room inside still looked strange to him sometimes because 6 months ago it had been storage space full of old boxes and broken tools he never bothered sorting through after his wife died. Now the walls held little paper drawings in uneven crayon colors. Tiny boots sat lined beneath the heater vent. 3 mismatched blankets covered the beds he built himself from salvaged lumber after realizing the girls slept better when they stayed close together. Emma opened her eyes halfway as Wyatt lowered her gently onto the mattress. You staying? She asked softly. Wyatt hesitated only a second before pulling the old rocking chair closer beside the bed. For a little while. Emma smiled immediately and curled beneath the blanket. Across the room, Irie climbed silently into bed while Nea tucked the blankets carefully around her little sister first before lying down herself. Saila stood near the doorway watching all of it with one hand pressed lightly against her mouth like she was trying to hold emotions together physically. Wyatt noticed Elora behind her in the hallway too. The older woman stared into the bedroom with eyes already shining in the dim light. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. The little room carried the soft sounds of children settling safely into bed. Heater humming, blankets rustling, Emma's breathing slowing gradually toward sleep. Wyatt leaned back slightly in the rocking chair and rubbed tired fingers over his eyes. The day suddenly felt very long. Then Emma spoke again, voice barely louder than a whisper. Mr. Wyatt? Yeah, kiddo. Her silver eyes blinked sleepily toward him from beneath the blankets. If Mama has to go away with the space people someday. Her small voice wavered slightly there. Wyatt felt every adult in the hallway go perfectly still behind him. Emma swallowed once before finishing softly. Can we still? Come back here. The room went silent. Completely silent except for the old heater rattling softly beneath the window. Wyatt looked at the little girl lying beneath handmade blankets in a room that smelled faintly like clean laundry and cornbread in safety. Then he looked toward Nea, who was pretending not to listen while holding Irie's hand beneath the covers. Then toward Saila standing frozen in the doorway with tears finally slipping silently down her face. Wyatt let out one slow breath through his nose. Emma, he said gently, this is your home now too. The little girl stared at him for one sleepy second longer as if making certain he meant it. Then her entire body relaxed into the mattress for the first time all night. Behind Wyatt, Elora Vermeyer quietly turned away and covered her eyes with one hand, because somewhere in the middle of warships and inheritance councils and interstellar politics, a lonely farmer on the edge of nowhere had accidentally given her family the one thing money and power never could.